Hello everyone, it's my pleasure to welcome Aaron Saiger back to Princeton, where he received his PhD from the Woodrow Wilson School. He's now a professor of law at Fordham Law School and an expert in education law and policy, and he's currently working on a book on schools and cloud computing. He's also been a National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow, a research fellow at Columbia Law School, and a clerk for both Judge and Justice Ginsburg. He's here today to talk about a topic that we've seen before in big data, which is tension between customization and privacy. But he's talking about it in a new and distinctive context, which is the rise of virtual K-12 education.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming, and to the Center for hosting me, and especially to my colleague Joel Reidenberg, who helped me to arrange this. I'm privileged to be here and happy to see everyone. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon is about the topic that I announced is toward information regulation in virtual K-12 schools. And I think about this project as one of what I'm starting to see as the next generation of work generally about information technology questions, which is there's a lot of stuff coming out now that is domain specific all of a sudden, that thinks about the penetration of information technology into particular domains and sectors that are already hugely complicated policy issues in their own right, and that are inhabited by policy people who are interested in those sectors. And suddenly, those people like me, whose expertise is not in information technology, but is in some policy sector, are confronting what the penetration of information technology is going to do to our policy and legal issues. It has already been deeply destabilizing, and it's going to get even more deeply destabilizing. There's now a book out of Brookings called Constitution 3.0, I believe, about that does this kind of work for constitutional law. There are some things coming out about antitrust. There are things about local government law. And I really think of myself as part of this trend. I'm here to talk to you about primary and secondary schools as a schools guy, right, who thinks about primary and secondary schools, and am only learning to think about information law. So I hope that I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm sure it will inform me as much as anyone else. It is certainly true that K through 12 schooling meets both the criteria that I mentioned. One, it's already complicated, right? You don't have to have any information technology to view this as a complicated and difficult policy issue. It's full of interesting, pressing, difficult, unsolved problems that we've been struggling to solve for a long time. None of those problems are getting any easier, and we're working on them. And it is subject to enormous destabilization. When I came to Princeton to study education law and policy in the mid-90s, we were already in the mode that there was some crisis. Was a word we tried to avoid, more or less, but it was okay to say that there was an educational crisis in K through 12. In the Reagan administration, there had been a, first, of course, you can pick any starting point, right? And at that starting point, people were suddenly worried that students weren't learning enough. They weren't learning the right things. They weren't going to be able to do X. What is X? People disagree violently about what X is. They weren't going to be able to be rich. They weren't going to be able to be citizens. They weren't going to be able to be fulfilled human beings. You can take your pick about what the goals of the education system is. It has multiple goals. Making those goals happen has been very hard since we've had schools in the United States. We have deep measurement problems, and we have deep equality problems. And so these are the policy problems, the big ones, that tend to shape what we worry about as education policy people. And in addition, this country in particular has a habit of using schools as a locus or playing field to work out every social conflict you can possibly imagine. We like to act these things out on the canvas of schools and school children's lives. We like to argue over whatever it is we're arguing over or unhappy about in our own lives. So we fight about race in schools, and class, and religion, and sexuality, and culture, and politics, and patriotism, and free speech, and every other kind of thing that people fight about. We have put into this arena because we get to tell children what to do, and it's more pleasant than being told what to do ourselves, I think, is a lot of it. And so all of these issues boil in the school context. And then what my project seeks to do is to think about these goals, these problems, and these conflicts, and look at the ways in which our responses are being destabilized by the technological changes we are facing. So I just want to say a couple things about the shape of that change. Since we're at a university, I probably don't need to do what I often do, which is note at the beginning that the higher education sector has seen this first. In universities in general, there's a lot of concern now about online education. In particular, the platform of the hour is still the massive open online course, or the MOOC, which has seized the imagination of many people in higher ed. I'm at Princeton today, so I imagine that here it might seize people's imagination with some enthusiasm, because Princeton can imagine itself as a provider of these things. Most academics, it seizes their imagination and fills it with fear and dread because they can imagine themselves being replaced by these things. And that has been a dynamic in higher ed now for a little while. The fact that these same technologies are penetrating into K through 12 has been less in the public eye than it has been in higher ed, but it is happening, and it's happening pretty quickly. I just wanted to show you 3 examples of what is going on, and they're not a complete taxonomy of examples by any means, just to give you a taste and a few details of the kinds of phenomena, the head and the nose in the tent pieces of these kinds of phenomena as they are growing very quickly. All of you will have seen some of them, I think, but I just want to give you a sense of a few things that are going on. So one thing is that this is not an all-or-nothing operation. So the penetration of technology into schools, as everyone surely understands, is not, we have none today, and we have purely online education tomorrow. These things are happening gradually. An important player in this story has been an outfit called the Khan Academy, which many of you are familiar with. The story of the Khan Academy is lovely because it's just this guy who was trying to help his niece, I believe, with her homework, and wound up making this set of videos. Many of you have seen this, but for those of you who haven't, I want to give you a 90-second taste of what it's like to do your math class as a high school student online. This is free. I got here in 5 seconds from the website, and I tried to pick something that was somewhere in the middle, something that not only can my high school student do, but I can pretty much do. So here's 90 seconds. I hope the volume is working. Didn't check that. Volume? Here it is. Okay, but we don't have volume.
Sits on the circumference of the circle. So that is our inscribed angle. I'll note it by psi. I'll use psi for inscribed angle and angles in this video. That psi, the inscribed angle, is going to be exactly 1/2 of the central angle that subtends the same arc. So I just used a lot of fancy words, but I think you'll get what I'm saying. So this is psi. It is an inscribed angle. It sits, its vertex sits on the circumference, and if you draw out the 2 rays that come out from this angle, or the 2 chords that define this angle, it intersects the circle at the other end. And if you look at the part of the circumference of the circle that's inside of it, that is the arc that is subtended by psi.
That was about a minute, right? So those of you who remember math from high school will see a strong commonality between, this is on purpose, right? This looks like it's on a blackboard. It looks a lot like what happens in, I suspect, classrooms on this campus, as well as in high school campuses across the country. This is a determinedly low-tech thing in its presentation, right? But it has a few interesting virtues. One is that we can decide to do it now. And 2 is that you can rewind it, right, which is a beautiful thing. The conceptualist in me views this as a talking textbook and no more, right? This is just a book. Its analogy is a book, but in the same sense that you can rewind the book, you can rewind this. But it appears that for many people, this is better than the book, especially for mathematics, because he's drawing and talking as he goes. Math textbooks tend to be, you have to look at the finished diagram, and they're harder to work with. These things are being used in schools across the country right now. They have been a major engine in what we call the flipped classroom, in which teachers who used to do this as a lecture in class now assign the lecture as your homework, right? And then you sit and you do your problems in the classroom where the teacher can move around. This is what we call, in the pedagogy business, a flipped classroom. If you look, I won't show you this afternoon for want of time, there's a catalog of all of these lectures, and it goes from how to add to one-digit numbers all the way up to simple differential equations. That's where he stops, unfortunately. These things are available, and they are in use for free by teachers across the country, and in particular by homeschoolers across the country who are very enthusiastic about access to this kind of material. I just met with some students of mine this week, and I said to them, how can I improve my teaching? And they said, you could tape your classes, and then we could rewind when you don't understand what you're saying because you talk too fast. And I said, but if I did that, you wouldn't come. And they said, that wouldn't be so bad. And so, so that's the first thing I want to show you. Another thing I want to show you is something that appeared in the New York Times 2 years ago, a very different kind of story about a little girl in South Carolina with a congenital heart defect. And this little girl cannot leave her house because it was unclear from the story, and I decided not to ask the human subjects people to actually let me contact the family to get the whole story because I don't really need to know. But for some medical reason, she cannot leave her house. She'd been tutored for many of the years of primary school, and then a company called Vigo, does anybody know Vigo? Provided her with a piece of technology which is essentially a cart with a laptop and a Skype connection on the top of the cart. And the cart has a mobile internet connection, and you can move the cart around remotely. So the Times published this set of 7 slides of this little girl and her Vigo cart, which goes to school for her. So I just want you to see these photos. I don't think the last time I tried to do this, I could not blow up the photos to full screen. We won't try to do that here, so I hope that these are visible. The Skype connection projects her photo to her classmates, and it projects what the camera above her photo is taking to her. I'll just show you the pictures. I'm always inclined to comment, but they really speak for themselves. Cute little girl is a big theme in virtual education right now. A lot of the materials I will show you have the cute little girl theme in them. This picture is designed to show you that she is cute and likes rainbows. This is supposed to make you feel good about this enterprise. Here she is again, her face beamed to her classmates. Notice that she's dressed the cart up. This is her experience, right? She's at home. There's a big screen and a joystick, and she moves the cart around, and she sees what the camera sees. And this is her classmates' experience. The thing stands online with them. The Times reports that when there was a fire drill, her classmates insisted on carrying the robot outside, even though it wasn't necessary, because they weren't about to leave their friend behind, right? That wouldn't be. So this is actually pretty important, right? Because it's one thing to get her academic instruction, and it's another thing to get her the effective experience of being in school, which especially for the parents of disabled children is huge, right? And to find a way to get her not only math instruction, which we could use Khan Academy for, but this kind of experience is extraordinary. There's 2 more. This is a picture that I love, right? This is the math teacher the teacher of something. In action, they're all at their little pod. And she just leans over into the camera, and then presumably in 30 seconds she's going to turn to the child next door. One more. At day's end, Lexi guides her robot to a charging station. That's the little caption. So I talked about this little girl at the We Robots conference that happened in Miami a few weeks ago, and one of the things I learned at that conference was that this is not a robot, because they were quite adamant, the robots people wanted me to know this is not a robot because it's just telepresence. It doesn't make any decisions on its own. But it's very easy to get from here to hybrid arrangements, especially if you consider the range of disabilities that are out there for kids, right? So if kids have visual disabilities or motor disabilities, putting overlays onto this thing so it isn't just Skype, but is a somewhat more complicated arrangement where data gets moved back and forth. If the kid has motor issues so she can't move the robot on its own, the robot could move in ways that we guess would be helpful to her. There are all sorts of things that could happen where this model becomes of interest. But I'm particularly interested for our purposes today in this picture, this one, the one that I just passed. Because the experience that she is having, right, does not actually require there to be a building on the other side. You could you could give all of the kids one of these, right? And if all of them had it, then you could close the school building and do this on a virtual platform. That is not happening to my knowledge anywhere, though, although if anybody knows to the contrary, please let me know. But I expect it to happen, right? That it will be, there's some higher ed going on Second Life, so I guess in that sense that it is happening. But if everybody has a screen like this, then you can ditch the very expensive building and the very expensive robots and move forward. Does the center have etiquette about questions in the middle? I'm happy for questions in the middle, but so please.
But it seems like the real reason we have school buildings is to put the children someplace when the parents are at work, and that delivering educational content to them at home doesn't really achieve the main thing we want to do, which is have an adult supervising them so they don't burn something down.
So this is very interesting. I have often heard in the higher ed, especially among like liberal arts college people, that's why they say the liberal arts college will survive virtual education, right? Because parents need a place to warehouse persons who are between the ages of 18 and 22 who are neither capable of functioning as adults nor livable with on the part of adults. And so they have to be put somewhere else, and you might as well send them to class while they're at it, right? And so this is definitely the notion. So I'll say a couple things about that. One is that you're right about the issue. Two is that the issue is different for little kids and big kids, right? So high school is a whole different picture than little children. And three is the amount of skill and training you need to be the person in charge of the room is different than the amount of skill and training that you need to be to teach those children mathematics. And I will come back to an example if we have a chance. Well, I'll just give you a little preview, right? One thing that is happening is that religious schools, Catholic schools, there are a few Jewish schools I know of, are using this method to sign their kids up for secular education at state expense, and they do their adult supervision. They put the kids online in the back of the class. They teach their religious course to the front of the class. Then they flip the kids, and they've just saved roughly 2/3 of their budget once you subtract the fixed costs of capital, which are already sunk. So you're right, but that doesn't pour as much cold water on this as one might have imagined. I want to show you one more website, and then I'll be done with my audio-visual portion. Several big states, Florida is the leader, but Texas, Wisconsin, a couple others, have established state virtual schools or school districts that you can attend in some way as a high school student in that state. You can attend them on a course-by-course basis, and you can attend them on a school basis. This can be your only school. So one has to pay a fair amount to get into this website if one is not in Florida, which we are not, and I was not prepared to do that. But I did want to show you the introductory screen. The first thing it says on the first screen of the website is, these courses are free to students in Florida, and they're available for a fee to students who do not live in Florida. And the second thing it says, I'm just reading to you now, our teachers are real. Our coursework is real. The grades you receive at the end of each course are real, just so that you know that they're not virtual. They're virtual, too. This has been deeply attractive in many ways to many people. It's attractive if you want to take Italian and your high school doesn't offer Italian. It's attractive if you are the state legislature that wants to cut your education budget and imagines, truly or falsely, that this is cheaper than the old way. The jury is out on that at this moment. Clearly, they're hoping to earn some out-of-state money. And so these things are going on. Right now, the most popular virtual course in the country is, I'm taking a guess, we'll play Can You Guess? Because you'll never guess.
Philosophy of Duke.
No, for high school students.
Gun safety.
Physical education is the most popular virtual course online, and the reason for that, as implausible as it seems, is that more or less, not to denigrate any PE teachers in the room, the job of the PE teacher is to stand there and watch. And so that is reasonably easily replaced by a system in which you log your physical activity onto the machine, you get your course credit, and you move on. The homeschooling sector is all over this. The difficulty of the economic and other obstacles to homeschooling, one of them is the ones you mentioned, right? That you have to have an adult there. But the adult also has to be capable. And these kinds of things have allowed for homeschoolers the barriers to homeschooling have gone down dramatically with the advent of this technology. The charter school movement matters in this respect. There are cyber charter schools now all over the country where you can enroll a student in a cyber charter school. It gets its state money the same way a regular bricks and mortar charter school gets it. It gets its $11,000, $12,000 per student from the state. It goes to the real teachers. There are teachers behind these platforms, right? There are living beings. They have not yet mechanized the teaching function, although they will eventually do so. That sector is growing. Okay. The question about whether this is the single best thing to happen to schooling since paper and pencil, or whether this is the beginning of a grossly dystopian brave new world is unclear at this time. And what I would like you to leave with, if anything, is only a lively appreciation of how it could be either. So I do want to say that there's an enormous amount of good that is coming out of this that is very hard to object to. The fact that that little girl can go to school strikes me as unbelievably positive, right? And that's not exactly virtual education, right? But the ability for a smart kid whose high school has run out of things for her to take, right, to get educational content, even if she lives far away from from a university that's usable, is a great thing. You can go to school on your own time. This is old, right? Broadway stars and student athletes used to do this by correspondence when they couldn't have computers. So this is a very important improvement. I have to say, from my point of view, parents of disabled children in particular are deeply thankful to be living when they are living and not just 15 years ago, because the ways that this is changing special education are enormous. There are huge economic implications for the business model of schools. We know that from higher ed. It's certainly true in virtual ed, and those are very important too. But my project for this afternoon is not to talk about those two questions, not to talk about pedagogy, and not to talk about economics, but instead to talk about government regulation, right? So if the question is, schools are a very heavily regulated sector, right? First of all, about 88% of K through 12 education is provided by the government, and the other 12% is deeply regulated by the government, the private school industry, the homeschooling sector. The way we regulate those things depends on, as with regulation of any industry, how they work, right? That's what regulators do, is they look at the way the industry works, and they try to address the problems that that industry has because of the way it works, and to find the regulatory system that is appropriate. This is a big enough change, what I present to you as my proposition, is that this is a big enough change that it's going to require very substantial regulatory change. There is a way to push back on that. When television came in, people thought television was going to transform schooling. They did. Yeah. They thought that teachers would be replaced by TVs, and there was even a move, as we are now wiring schools, to bolt television sets to classrooms across the country. There was a university in England that ran their courses on the radio, I think. I can't remember if it was radio or television, right? But these were not game-changing technologies for schools, right? The schools that I went to after television was mature were the same. They were obviously the same species as the school that my parents went to when television was here, but youngish, and more or less the same as the ones my grandparents went to before television. On the other hand, radio and TV are not the only technological changes that we have. The real technological revolution in education, the last one, was the late 1800s. And the technology was the building, the school bus, the road that lets you put a lot of kids together in one place. It was that fact that we had the technology to concentrate children in one place that totally changed the way we did education, because we used to have people who read like Little House on the Prairie, right, as children, that model where the neighbors would get together and engage one teacher for the neighborhood children of whatever age was the model. It was technology that let us put enough students together that you could have graded schoolhouses, that you could have consolidated high schools that had a chemistry lab, right? Those kinds of things came in because of technological change. And my rough view is that this technological revolution is much more similar to the revolution of building and bus and, in the South, the air conditioner, than the TV and radio thing, which really changed us only at the margins. All of our regulatory approaches to education came after that technological revolution was mature. Nothing has changed that much, right? Those changes. Our regulatory system, and in particular the American instinct to legalize every interesting question about educational policy, is all after that. It's all in the context of these progressive schools, locally run, but much bigger than the 60,000 independent, tiny little one-room schoolhouse operations that we had, say, in 1840. And so I do think that our regulatory systems are founded on this notion of schools being concentrated in one place, relatively large, under local control. Those things are the things that this is going to break down. Just this sentence on this website that says, oh, we're in Florida, we have a virtual school district, but anybody who's not in Florida is welcome to pay us to consume our content, is a totally different governance structure than what we have now. There was a question over here? No, okay. So this is my broad interest, is in how these regulatory frameworks are going to change, and we obviously don't have time to talk about the billion ways in which they will change. So what I propose to do in the 10 minutes I think I have left, maybe a little less, is to give you the list of chapters in the book that I intend to write about this subject, so you have a sense of the breadth of the regulatory changes that I'm thinking of, and then to talk about the topic that I know is closest to this group's heart, which is information storage and privacy and all of those issues. So let me just say a few very general things. Since I have been in this business, the animating question in education policy is resource inequality. Or more accurately, is inequality of resources and also by race. Those questions tend to merge, but they are at least conceptually different. The whole idea of the local school is an artifact of technology. It's an artifact of this bus, road, building arrangement. You can go to school online. It doesn't matter where you are, right? This is the whole point. The asynchronicity and the aterritoriality of the virtual school utterly undermines the justification for localism. Localism has become, in the United States, the primary governance structure, and it is used to reinforce inequality all over the country. If you read the sort of a classic left-wing Jeremiads against about how unequal and disgusting American schools is, Jonathan Kozol, people like him, he wrote this very famous book called, the last one was called Amazing, the first one called Savage Inequalities, and what he did was he toured the country and he would find two high school districts that were next to one another. One was rich and one was poor, and he would take his little Volvo back and forth, right, and he would write a chapter. Two schools in Michigan, one of which looks like it has been deposited from some kind of Jetsons-era spaceport, and the other one looks like it was built out of cardboard scraps right in the middle of the jungle. And isn't this horrible? It is horrible. The justification for it, in part, is that we have local control. And we have local control in large part because you need to put students together. And if you need to put students together, you need borders. All of those things are going away. So one deep question is, to what extent can the virtualization of K through 12 schools undermine the school district? The local school district is how we distribute money in education. It's how we count to see if a school is segregated. Segregation cases look at racial proportions in school districts. All of these things are localized, and so those things are going to have to change. Then there are questions about equality that aren't about money and resources. There are questions like, could you have a virtual education platform where teachers actually would not know the race and gender of their students? So there was just a major education law case out of the Supreme Court a few years ago in which Chief Justice Roberts got himself in a large amount of trouble for saying the following: the way to stop discriminating by race is to stop discriminating by race. And many right-thinking people correctly thinking people on the left, right, who think of themselves as understanding these things, and I'm taking no position about that, excoriated him for this comment because everybody thinks about race in the United States, was their counterclaim. You can't imagine a world in which a teacher would not think about race in the face of racially diverse kids. Well, I can think of one now. It's one where the code doesn't let the teacher know what the race and gender of her students are or his students are. Is that a more diverse school or a less diverse school? Reasonable people are going to disagree about that, right? On some versions of on the Roberts version of diversity, this is an improvement. On plenty of other people's version of diversity, this is a disaster, right? Because it hides difference, it disguises difference, it minimizes difference. That question, which used to be a conceptual question, is Roberts right? Is Roberts wrong? Theoreticians wrote about that, but now it's becoming a practical question about designing the platform, and that's going to be hugely important. It's going to be important for disability. Again, as I said, the parents of disabled kids are thrilled, but they're also worried, right? They ought to be worried. In particular, they ought to be worried about our legal regime now says you must mainstream disabled children in regular classrooms to the extent that it is educationally feasible. It's not even clear what a mainstream is going to be when everyone is picking from a menu that extends across the country, taking one course from the Florida virtual school and something else from something else. What it means to be accommodated, what it means to be in the mainstream, who has to pay for these things, all of those structures now rest on a technology that is going to move. I want to say one more thing, which is that speech has been of particular interest to lawyers, and anyone who reads the news knows that there's a lot of interest in students, middle school and up, I guess even in elementary school now, on social media who use social media as a way to torture one another. This has been a problem which has attracted a lot of interest, and it has made utter mincemeat of the regulatory structures that we have. The regulatory structures that we have is that in a public school authorities, the principal, the school board, have disciplinary authority over what students say while they are in school. If I stand up in the school lunchroom and call my principal a mean name, I can be punished by the government, right? Those people are the government. The principal's the government. If I get up and say, Principal Jones is an idiot, I can't always be punished, but he has authority over me, right, in that situation. But if I go home and say it on the phone to my friends, I can't be punished, right? Then I'm a citizen. Then it's the same statement as Obama's an idiot, right? That's a political comment about a government official. But in school, I can be punished for behavior like that. Or if I say, my friend is a moron, or something worse. What students actually say about each other on social media is shudderingly horrible. And as everyone knows, it's led to deaths. The disciplinary structure now gives teachers the authority to say, you can't talk to your classmate like that, even if it happens in the hall, even if it happens on the ball field. But they can't follow you home, right, and watch what you say at home. Those lines are falling apart, right? And the social media bullying and nasty school comments cases show how this little change, right, about location and jurisdiction has totally made it extraordinarily difficult to figure out what the right rules ought to be. I wanted to mention that case because it comes back to us with respect to information storage. So the last thing I want to say is, if you're in a virtual school and you take your chemistry class or your math class or your gym class online, what does this mean that the government knows about you? They know everything that you have said in class, right? It's one thing to know what your final grade is. That's what the government knows about you now, right? There's this old trope in American education, your permanent record. Anyone who went to public school has heard this phrase, this will go on your permanent record. The subtext is most things don't go on your permanent record, right? Your final grades go on your permanent record, and your SAT scores go on your permanent record. And if you blow up the school, it goes on your permanent record. But if you call your teacher a mean name, or you say something stupid in class, or you pass a note to your friend, or you make a fool out of yourself in the class play, or any number of other things, those things are not in the permanent record. They are gone. Nothing is gone, right, if you go to school virtually. So we have a different kind of data collection problem in the virtual school than we have in the current bricks and mortar school, which is a big enough data collection problem as it is. As I know Professor Reidenberg knows, and many of you know, there's an upside and a downside to this, right? The notion that you could have a data set that has deeply rich data about every student in it, and that you could use it for pedagogical purposes to deeply understand. There are platforms now that schools can buy that you can look at the progress of each student on their homework assignments and identify their areas of need and their areas of concern in a way that was just impractical for a math teacher carrying a load of 120 kids before, and is now practical, is enormous. It's enormous. But on the other hand, the government knows every math question you've ever gotten right and wrong. Move that over to social studies, and you start to worry a little bit more than you might worry about it in mathematics. And you have a data set that people like, well, not exactly like me, but people in the education schools can use, right, to figure out what best practices are. That's deeply rich and longitudinal and cross-sectional in a way that there's never been data like that before. It would be impossible to imagine what the grant proposal would look like to gather the homework assignments of 3 million children across 10 years, across states and localities before, and now I'm starting to imagine that I could have a data set like that. And then I could do things in math pedagogy or history pedagogy that have never been done. So it's a little bit like the medical records dispute, right? There's a lot of potential both for direct patient care and for one step back research. That's true in the educational side too. In addition, we have had an accountability movement in the schools about our teachers doing a good job. One thing that teacher organizations and teachers themselves have resisted about the educational accountability movement is that the tests are bad, right? That these standardized tests do not measure what we are doing properly. Well, I'll offer you more data, right? And then you can use them to develop your accountability regime, and that has a lot of appeal to those of us, which includes me, who think that accountability is useful for schools. But when Bentham wrote about the panopticon, this is roughly what he was imagining. It's actually 2 steps worse, right? Because Bentham just says, in my panopticon prison, everything a prisoner does is capable of observation. In the virtual school, not only is it capable of observation, it will be recorded, and it will be preserved, right? It can potentially be preserved. And it's exactly like the panopticon because students have no choice. This is not a consumer context. Every state requires students to go to school. You are a draftee when you are a student, and that means that the government is putting you in a situation where they can see everything that you do. This is why the speech cases are so important, because in the bullying context, the move of most state authorities, both in schools and out, has been to expand the jurisdiction of schools over students in order to get at cyberbullying. And if you do that, then for how much of your life can the government watch you? It's starting to seem like more and more. If you go to an asynchronous school, when are you in school and when are you not in school? One possible answer is you're always in school. And it's especially possible if the government gives you your computer, which they probably will have to do for poor kids, right? And so the surveillance possibilities of this issue are fairly large. And then, of course, there is the fact that given that they are large, this could be the actual motive for going into the virtual school business, right? I expect this to be a privatizing moment. I do. I think that the same forces that blur the need to be in one place at one time altogether are going to make it much easier to blur the lines between public and private. And companies are going to enter this space, and they may want those data more than they want anything else, right? That doesn't have to be nefarious, right? It can just mean this is my business, this is my profit center. The profit center is the data, and I use the money to educate the kids, right? And that could be done it could certainly be done with well intentions, and it could certainly plausibly be worth it. But how do we decide if it's worth it or not? On that front, it's very hard to find the right set of analogies to current regulatory regimes. The current model that says that's embodied more or less in the Educational Rights Records Privacy Act, FERPA, is that education records should not be able to be disseminated or used except for, quote, legitimate educational purposes. Either that is going to just fall apart because we'll define legitimate educational purposes in an expansive fashion, or it will block a lot of the potential benefits of this technology. The consumer models are hopeless as far as I can tell. I don't know enough about them, as much about them as I would like to, but they seem to rest on this idea of informed consent, right? That you know what data will be recorded and how they will be used. But first of all, these are children. And second of all, they're draftees, right? And so on both of those fronts, consumer products, consumer information privacy regimes that say you can trade away your privacy in return for the ease and functionality of Dropbox do not work as well when, one, you're too young to decide, and two, you have to do it whether you like it or not, right? So those are problems. And I should say, some of these virtual schools are not optional. In Florida, I believe right now, my understanding is, to graduate high school in Florida, you must take one class on this platform. And so it's not completely optional. On the other hand, I have to say the accountability regimes that we have, the federal one, No Child Left Behind, and the state analogs, appear to be utterly deaf to the privacy issue. They're totally interested in accountability. They're totally interested in what works. You describe the big data to people who think that way, and they salivate all over the table, and they just do not hear the issues of what could be done with those data. There has been some writing about, at sort of an abstract level, about whether privacy in your data is correlative to some right, a constitutional right, a human right, some kind of right that you have, right? That my ability to speak or not to speak, or to associate or to refuse to associate, is somehow impinged upon if, when I do speak or choose not to speak, data about that flows into some central database. Education is a legal right in this country, right? It is a constitutional right in 49 of the 50 states. It is easy to imagine that one could develop technical legal arguments that, given that we force you to get your education and you have a right to get it, that we cannot attach to that right and that duty correlative consequences about what the government knows about you. I have not developed that argument yet, but it's something that I am thinking about. It's a technical idea, but it is, as a concept, it's not technical at all, right? The question is, in design, thinking about how these schools should be allowed to organize themselves, how heavy-handed, how open to technology, how concerned ought we be about this panopticon problem? And I think it's going to be hard no matter what. I will say that we make students give up a lot of rights to get their education. They lose their right, they lose their freedom, right? You have to go to school. You have to sit in class. You can't say what you think, right? I cannot stand up in math class and say, Obama is an idiot. You just can't do those things, right? And schools are totalitarian environments, not purely totalitarian, but much more totalitarian than the public square. And we force people to go. And the willingness that we have to deprive children of rights to get their education is well established and correct, for that matter. So this is not a binary question of right and wrong, right? This is a question of how we're going to thread a needle through very deeply changing technological circumstances. I think that's where I'll stop and see if anybody has any questions or comments. Yes, sir.
Yeah, actually, two comments. One of which will be carried around the table, I suspect. We've had people come in and talk about consumer choice and privacy, and basically taking the attitude of, yeah, sure, you have the choice of reading the privacy policy on everything you click on, or you click on it, including the ones that don't actually provide little read here buttons, because they're data being handed by A to B to C before C sells it. And this is not real either. As a historical note, I have It may be available. It may be available online, and if not, if you're interested, I can send it to you. There is an autobiographical account of one of the first county superintendent in one of the New Jersey counties, which makes clear that in fact the regulatory environment of the large collected graded school started in the 1880s. It may not have been generally practical until you had motorized, but in a sufficiently urbanized area you could have them. And that in fact the whole idea of superintendents and principals arose probably around the 1840s, as best I can read between the lines, when the privatized form of education collapsed. You needed a subsidy because you weren't getting enough, because the private market wasn't doing enough, and that became the local board of education that handed out the subsidy to all the various local schools, various local one-room schools. And you needed a county superintendent to be sure that the local one-room schools were actually, teaching anything. And this became first the county superintendent, and then when the system actually began to flourish, became municipal superintendents. I think that was in the 60s. The name I have this from is Samuel Lockwood. It was published by the local historical society in Monmouth County Historical Society, and I happen to have a copy, but I can send it to you if you're interested.
So you said two things. I want to react to both of them. I'll do them in reverse. I'll think about them in reverse order. The progressive revolution in American education is commonly dated 1880 to 1920-ish. So that's it certainly was not an all of a sudden change. The thing you said towards the end, you needed a school superintendent in order to make sure that these small schools were actually, teaching anything. That is a post-progressive view of what government regulators are supposed to do. Make sure that consumers are getting quality for their money. But that doesn't have to be the regulatory view, right? That was the progressive revolution in education, was the notion that the government should take upon itself the regulatory capacity to make sure that schools were providing goods in a way that the government thought was appropriate. My real interest in this change, and it's not just about technology by any means. If I implied that, I apologize, right? It was deeply tied up with Wilsonian progressivism, with the idea that expertise in public management was the right thing to care about, and so you should get professional school superintendents and teachers who've been trained in teachers' colleges and not just young women waiting to get married, right, to be the teachers. So all of those things were tied together. But to my mind, the most important historical difference between that moment and this moment is that the progressives seized upon technological change as a way to move forward a political regulatory agenda. They saw the changes in technology and that those changes were going to allow the consolidation of students into larger institutions as their moment. And they saw it as a moment to push expertise. They also had a democratic agenda in which the common school would be available across class and immigration differences. And they used technological change to move their political agenda forward. As near as I can tell in our context, the only groups that really see technological change in education as a political opportunity to reshape the way that we do education are on the right. They are the evangelical homeschooling movement. There is a rump left homeschooling community, but it's very small, right? Mostly it's right-wing Christian homeschoolers. And more power to them. They have noticed that in this technology is a way to advance their vision of the good. And there has not been a corresponding progressive moment as far as I can tell. Yes, sir?
So if I am the Khan Academy, I can keep any data I like about my students, and I can do what I like with it because I'm a website and they're a customer. Suppose at the end of a unit I gave them a letter grade. I can still do what I like with that, presumably. Somewhere along the line, as I start to get more school-like, FERPA kicks in. Where's that point? When do you really become a school? Like, what if the state of Florida says, well, gosh, we think that anything that the Khan Academy thinks is, qualified as statistics, we think qualifies as statistics?
I think that is the right question. I think it's even harder than it sounds because it's not just the Khan Academy, right? The cram school industry that exists now to prepare high school students who want to go to Princeton by forcing them to spend all of their extra hours outside of school doing it again the right way, right? Those are not FERPA institutions under my understanding. But that doesn't mean they couldn't be, right? There's no libertarian law that tells the government about the scope of its regulatory power over a website like Khan Academy, especially if its customers are children, right?
Either by statute or just by judicial construction, decide that on second thought those are covered by FERPA.
FERPA as written. FERPA as written, right? But
You're saying this would require a new statute?
oh yes, under the current statute, you certainly could not come after Khan Academy unless they wanted to be accredited as private schools who fulfilled the obligations of students to go to school. Right? I can't, and that's not the way FERPA is written. Yeah, that would be
FERPA is
FERPA.
just a funding. It's
Yeah.
the funding power.
So what I was wondering about is, what if a real FERPA-covered school decides to just grant transfer credit for a thing that came from the unregulated world? Right? This could probably happen even more easily in higher ed, where colleges are very generous about transfer credit, and they're not looking closely at what goofy foreign school you got your transfer credits from.
You're probably better situated to answer this question than I am.
You mean whether that would then be protected information, or
Yeah,
how it would
what would be protected, and against whom would those obligations be?
Well, FERPA, as it's currently written, only applies to institutions that get federal funding.
Yeah.
And it's confidentiality statute for the educational record.
Yeah.
So if Princeton, for example, were to accept Khan Academy badges as credits, once Princeton accepts it, it becomes part of Khan Academy.
Can
will
still do
assume
it like.
Khan Academy will assume gets no federal money, it's not covered by FERPA. Once the badge is accepted by Princeton and incorporated into the Princeton record for that student, then the confidentiality obligations apply to what Princeton does
Got it.
with that information. Can I, since
Yeah.
I want to push you on something I think is really fascinating, that you obliquely alluded to, and that's whether you're painting a picture here of the demise of public education. Because you noted, I look at like three different things that are isolated pieces in your talk. On the one hand, you talked about this as being sort of a decentralization moment in education. That where the kid is sitting at home, they can now do it virtually. That virtual nature of it means they're no longer wedded to the local community. So it's decentralized, and the child doesn't have to go to a single place. But it's no longer local in that sense. Control for schools has traditionally been handled locally, and the financing of schools has been handled locally. If what happens now, and the development of the platforms turn out from what you were describing to be incredibly important for various embedded policies. So the example you gave where the teachers don't know race or gender of their students. Well, that's a policy choice that would be made and embedded into the particular technological platform. Those choices are going to be made, the platform choices are going to be made depending on who's paying for it. If the payment is no longer coming from the local community because the child may or may not be interacting in the local community, and we have a very atomistic environment for education where it can be delivered by anyone from anywhere, monetized through some of this data mining and metadata, isn't that really spelling out that we are at a point that's a really threshold moment for whether or not we're going to have public education?
What I would say about that, and I've thought about this a lot, is that I think that this is a moment that makes that possible future more likely, but that it is not the necessary end of this road. And there's two features to this. One is the change is not immediate, right? Change is gradual. So one thing that I think is likely to happen is that the atomistic ability to stitch together an educational platform will precede the shift from the local platform for the duty to. So if I had to guess, what I would guess is that we will see a world first in which I can arrange for my virtual education however I want, but my locality subvents me, right? My budget is determined by my locality. I don't think that's a long-term equilibrium because it's preposterous, but I think as a short-term equilibrium, it's quite likely because of the path-dependent way that we have taken through this. But I also think one thing I did not get a chance to talk about, right, is that if you read Dewey or Horace Mann or any of the other progressive and pre-progressive educational thinkers, and if you read some of the state educational adequacy opinions that have come out of state Supreme Courts about school funding in the last 20 years, they're really interested in the democratic function of schooling, right? That schooling prepares children to be part of a democracy. And that runs through a lot of our regulatory approaches and things as diverse as religion and funding and a bunch of other things. So it is quite easy to imagine a localist version, something like the textbook market, right? So right now we have this odd thing in the United States, right, where local schools pick the textbooks. But the big animals on the street drive the market because they're the big animals. So the Texas School Board and the California School Board, those are the rules that the textbook manufacturers care about, and then the other school boards are take it or leave it customers of the policy decisions that get made and driven by these big players. So I can imagine a situation like that evolving. But I do think that we could also see diversity in state level. I think the local thing will fade, but I'm not sure the state thing will fade as quickly with respect to that. The other thing I want to say is that what it means to have public education is not so clear. The market's people think that you have a public education system if you have a voucher system, right? That all it means to have a public school is that the state is required to pay for you to get access to education. This is how we have public services. We treat as public services even though they are arranged on a purely privatized contractual basis, and it doesn't bother people. That's not what we think of. It's not what a lot of people think of as public school. The bundle of publicly required, publicly subvented, publicly managed, publicly provided, publicly contracted for. Right now, that's because of the progressive revolution. That's been a bundle of things. A public school is one where the locals pay taxes, the government pays, the government decides, the government hires, the government fires. You get to go if and only if you're a resident of the jurisdiction in which you're in. Those things can be unbundled. And this will unbundle them. Whether the bundles that we have left, the diverse bundles that we have left, can accurately be called public education is going to depend on where you sit. I think we're out of time, is what I'm being told. So this is the end of the formal time. So I thank everyone for their attention very much. And